John Kennedy said, "The future happens first in California." Since the gold rush, the Golden State has been hated, loved, envied, resented, and admired throughout the world. The Earth's fifth largest economy, the land of Hollywood dreams, startups, and tech visionaries, is still poorly understood, even by those who live there. California is not a place, or even a region. It is a realm of regions, each more different and diverse from its neighbors than any place on Earth. Listen as this podcast reveals the most fascinating facts and insights, most unknown, except by a few, about this most influential and consequential land of superlatives.
This is the new podcast about pre-Gold Rush California. Welcome to Digital Voices. This is Robert Mills, your host for this podcast. This podcast is a prequel to my earlier Digital Voices podcast about contemporary California. There, we talked about this amazing place today that very few understand, this astonishing land of extremes called California. As a Californian for many years, I myself learned a lot doing the research for that podcast, and it surprised me. If you have not listened to that podcast, I think you're going to enjoy it, if I do say so myself. And I recommend that you listen to it next because it logically and chronologically follows this broadcast and shares with you some incredible facts and stories about present-day contemporary California. Here in this podcast, we're going to have some fun. We're going to go way back to the beginning and talk about what it was like in California and tell the fascinating story of what happened here from the time the first humans arrived about 15,000 years ago, all the way until the discovery of gold and the start of what was the greatest peacetime migration in the history of the world. This is an incredibly fascinating period that most of us know very little about, and where many interesting and consequential things occurred. So sit back and enjoy this newest episode of Digital Voices and learn about California from its very earliest beginning. So let's start with that very brief discussion of the pre-human geology of California. As you know, humans have only been around in California for a tiny sliver of geologic time, which stretches back for millions, indeed billions of years. Unlike many regions on Earth, which have long geologic histories and lots of old rocks and fossils, California, geologically speaking, is a relative latecomer. In fact, there are very few rocks in California that are more than 600 million years old, and that's young for a rock. There are a few, but they are rare. They're mostly in the southern part of the state. The great majority of California's surface geology is less than 600 million years old, which again, for rocks, is young. The most notable feature about California is that most of it was under the sea until relatively recently, geologically speaking, at least that portion that is west of what is now the Sierra Nevada mountains. The west coast of North America was, until recent geologic time, east of what is now the southern end of California. That's why there are no dinosaur fossils anywhere in California. California was largely under the sea when dinosaurs roamed the earth. Many of California's most distinctive geologic features are new, at least in geologic time frames. For example, the Muir Crest, which is the highest section of the Sierra Nevada mountains that rise a majestic 10,000 feet over the west side of the Owens Valley, where Mount Whitney and the highest peaks in the Sierra are located, was uplifted a mere 3 million years ago. In contrast, the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States were uplifted 80 million years ago. What geologists and paleontologists call the Pleistocene era began 1.8 million years ago and ended only 11,000 years ago. During a recent portion of the Pleistocene era, between 200,000 years ago and 13,000 years ago, there were 4 separate ice ages, not only in California, but over large portions of the northern hemisphere. As these ice ages progressed, they took enormous amounts of water out of the atmosphere and deposited it in the form of snow and ice in the mountains in the northern and polar regions of the northern hemisphere. This process, which removed water from the seas and deposited it in the form of ice and snow on land, caused the sea levels around the whole world to fall. Then, as the Earth's temperature warmed and the ice ages waned, the ice melted and the seas rose again. At the peak of the last ice age, about 25,000 years ago, the ice had grown so widespread and deep that it caused the sea levels at that time to fall as much as 400 feet or more. This most recent ice age resulted in the coast of California moving back and forth by as much as 40 miles east and west as the sea rose and fell over California's shallow continental shelf. During the recent portions of the Pleistocene era, the time between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, California's climate was mild and wet and lush, especially along its Pacific coast and Central Valley. This led some anthropologists to believe that 15,000 years ago there occurred the greatest concentration, density, and profusion of animal-wildlife species as ever occurred on any place on Earth ever, and it happened right here in California. During this time, vast herds of animals roamed along California's coastal plains and across its Central Valley. In addition to those species that we're familiar with today, like antelopes and bears and coyotes and deer, there were at that time camels, rhinoceroses, hyenas, mastodons, those elephant-like animals with huge tusks, orodonts, huge hooved animals that looked like a cross between a camel, a pig, and a sheep, saber-toothed cats, this California state fossil, ground sloths, and huge 150-pound dire wolves. There were several species of pronghorns, which is a type of antelope, and a multitude of other animals. These were just a few of the most notable species. Around 25,000 years ago, during the most recent ice age, there was a point reached that geologists call glacial maximum, which is that point in time where the glaciers around the world, especially in the northern hemisphere, reached their furthest advance toward the equator, and the ice was at its most widespread and deepest level. At this point, the Earth's glaciers trapped so much water in the form of ice that the sea level of the world's oceans had fallen to about 400 feet below where they are today. One result of this was to drain shallow portions of the seas around land masses, which exposed what are called continental shelves. In Alaska, this opened a broad, wide land bridge between Siberia and North America. It was possible at that moment to walk on dry land across the entirety of what is now the Bering Sea. It was another somewhat counterintuitive result of this climate change. The drier, cooler air and climate at that time resulted in a much lower snowfall in Alaska and Siberia. It was a lot colder, yes. That caused there to be less moisture in the air, because colder air can hold proportionately less moisture. So there was a lot. This lower level of moisture in the air in Alaska 25,000 years ago meant that a lot less rain and snow everywhere there. And this overall dryness actually contributed to opening up the land bridge and making it more accessible. This made the trek by human immigrants from Siberia to the west coast of North America much easier. Prior to and simultaneously with these climate changes and their results, there began an increase in the scale and the number of eastward human migrations across Siberia. This migration had begun much earlier west in Siberia on a smaller scale. All these people began heading east in waves. These immigrants followed the southern coast of Siberia eastward toward what is now the Bering Sea. But the Bering Sea was at that moment just an open, grassy plain of land. With the sea drained, an immense landmass between the Lena River in Russia and the Mackenzie River in Canada was exposed. The area between these two rivers, which existed as a landmass, was referred to as Beringia. These new migrants brought along kayaks, which they portaged, that is, they carried on their backs, as they traveled on land, and then when they were on or near water, they paddled them alongside the beaches as they headed east. Migrating in waves, they crossed Beringia on what is now Alaska, then continued on to the western coast of North America, and then southward toward what is now California. Traveling together in small groups or tribelets, these immigrants paddled together as extended families, children, grandparents, infants, dogs, all paddling along in these lightweight boats made out of animal skin and bones and reeds and wood. They carried spears and bows and arrows and crude fish hooks. Let's stop here and just imagine for a moment what this migration was like for these prehistoric immigrants. Imagine the courage and the resourcefulness it would take to make a voyage like this during an ice age. They left behind lands and terrain which they were much more familiar with familiar food sources and animals and plants, and headed vast distances into the unknown. The plants and wild animals in these new lands they paddled to were entirely unfamiliar to them. During these long treks, they wanted something to eat. They had to hunt and find it, then catch it, kill it, skin it, and cook it. They had no matches for fires in this rainy, snowy land. They had to build fires with flint rocks. Nor did they have any metal utensils, only carved ivory or sharp bones or obsidian rock. It was incredibly cold then, colder than it is now in Siberia and Alaska. If they wanted to stay warm, then for clothing they had to find and kill animals and stretch their skin and fur over themselves. There were no sunglasses or water storage, no protection from the cold rain or the winter snow, and no sanitation whatsoever. This is how our ancestors lived for thousands of generations as they migrated out of Africa and traveled tens of thousands of miles to lands all over the earth. Those places had vastly different climates from where these people had come from, with different animals and plants to catch and harvest. Survival in each of these different ecological systems of plants and animals required utilization of a completely different technology, so to speak, meaning ways to capture and kill edible animals, and knowing which plants and insects were edible and how to cook and prepare them. Imagine the challenge, the courage, and the resourcefulness that it required to survive these immigrations. About 13,000 years ago, the first vanguard, the earliest of a series of waves of Siberian migrants, arrived along the coast of what is now California. But at that point, the ocean was over 400 feet below what it is today. The encampments of these first arrivals, which were 20 to 40 miles out from the current coastline of California, on the grassy plains of the continental shelf, which was then above the sea. After the glacial maximum, about 25,000 years ago, global warming began. The warming really picked up speed around 11,000 years ago, as during that millennium global temperatures rose faster than any other, ever. This caused the glaciers to begin to melt and the sea level began to rise rapidly. As it did, those encampments of the Siberian migrants all along the California coast were inundated by the sea, along with almost all of the evidence of these first arrivals ever being here. But off the California coast near Santa Barbara are a series of nearby islands called the Channel Islands. Today, these islands are part of the Channel Islands National Park off the coast of California near Santa Barbara. Geologists long suspected that these kayaking Siberian migrants probably visited the Channel Islands, and if so, probably left evidence in caves on the islands, in the mountains high above the sea, where they were likely hunting game. And if so, evidence of their presence would likely be preserved there. They were right. Archaeologists went to and began excavating in the caves high in the mountains on Santa Rosa Island, one of the Channel Islands. When they dug down beneath the earthen floor of these caves, they found arrowheads, remnants of crude weapons like spears, bone fragments, and charcoal from prehistoric fires. When carbon dated, these artifacts proved to be over 13,000 years old. Other sites were found in caves and shelters on the Channel Islands, which dated to 11,000 years ago. This was clear proof that these prehistoric Siberian visitors had come here in waves over several millennia. Some of these early human visitors made landfall and decided to stay. Some of them set up new homes in various places along this coastal route. Others, however, continued south, some all the way to Patagonia at the southern tip of South America. Ferdinand Magellan, the great Spanish explorer of the 16th century, in his voyage around the world, encountered these kayaking peoples, living on the coast of what is now called the Magellan Strait. He and his crew named these peoples the Patagons because of their big feet. The name Patagonia means land of the Patagons. Other groups and tribes of these Siberian migrants stopped at various points up and down the west coast of North and South America and set up permanent coastal settlements. Others wandered inland before setting up villages and settlements. This process continued for thousands of years, with wave after wave of new arrivals. Soon, various groups and tribes were migrating about inland, far from their original embarkation points along the coast. These migrations continued in complex patterns, in overlapping routes and at various times, throughout North and South America. All this made it extremely difficult to determine who came from where and when. This was especially so in California, where there were literally hundreds of different migrations of large numbers of people coming in from the north, south, east, and west. In fact, California soon developed, because of its diversity, over 100 different cultures speaking over 55 languages, with a linguistics complexity far greater than Europe. As detailed in our earlier Digital Voices podcast about contemporary California, there is no place on Earth with more and greater differences in climate, in flora, and fauna in one place than California. Along the northwest coast, California has an immense rainforest, with rainfall over 100 inches a year. But in the southeastern portion, in the desert, there are vast regions which receive less than 4 inches of rain on average in a year. There are large portions of the desert near Death Valley, where the average rainfall is less than 2 inches, and sometimes in particular places, 5 years will go by without a single drop of water falling. Much of the visible surface water in many parts of California's desert areas is either brine-like or full of highly toxic heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, or lead. In the different locations in California, there are many different types of forest. There are grassy plains in the Central Valley, high mountains in numerous locations. Yet the humans who arrived here and went to live in all these different, vastly diverse regions adopted and developed the techniques, tools, and technology necessary to capture food and find and store water and build shelters and survive in all of these almost unimaginably different environments. The flora and fauna in each of these completely different regions required the development of entirely different technologies in order to survive. For example, the Paiutes in eastern California had to learn how to hunt in large groups, to join together and herd rabbits into a narrow dead-end area using fences made of sticks and leaves sewn together. Once corralled into the fenced area, the rabbits could be clubbed using wooden clubs and then eaten. Different tactics, such as disguises and bows and arrows, were used to hunt deer and antelope. The 100-plus tribes in California thus honed their skills and techniques and technologies over many centuries, learning to use various types and styles of weapons, trapping devices, fish hooks, bows and arrows to secure animals for food. Some, like the Digger Indians, discovered that grub worms or insects could be eaten, while other tribes did the same with plants and seeds and acorns. For example, the coastal Ahloni ate prodigious amounts of shellfish, such as mussels. In one place, next to the San Francisco Bay in Hayward, California, early European settlers were astonished to find a mound of mussel shells 200 feet high and 600 feet long. Archaeologists estimate that it would take over 100 persons over 5,000 years to consume that many mussels. Another example about how these Stone Age peoples were able to use technology to adapt and survive in this new environment evolves around acorns. Acorns were enormously plentiful and available throughout coastal California, growing in huge profusions in the ubiquitous oak trees. Their seed-like pods in these acorns, however, were full of a thick, highly nutritious paste, but it was so bitter and full of toxins that it simply couldn't be eaten raw. The coastal Miwok, however, figured out a way over centuries to use a fire to heat rocks, and then put the rocks into a depression filled with water from creeks or lakes. If the rocks were hot enough, they would cause the water to boil. the coast Miwoks then put the plentiful oak acorns into the boiling water. And when the rocks cooled, they put them back in the fire and put them back in the water. Eventually, a lengthy boiling removed the toxins, and the insufferable bitter lye in the acorns was taken out, eventually leaving a green, mushy, delicious acorn paste, which was high in calories and fat and nutrients. And the Miwoks then dried this and made a form of nutritious bread-like cakes. Eventually, as you could see, all of this diversity of California in terms of climates, landscapes, floras, and fauna led in turn to an extreme cultural and linguistic diversity in California, because all of these tribes lived entirely separately and apart from each other in these completely different ecologies. This was the situation when the Europeans first made contact in California. At the outset of the Spanish occupation, which occurred in 1769, because of its temperate and hospitable climate, California had by far the largest population of Native Americans in the entire United States, estimated at a minimum of 300,000, and some say as many as 600,000. Given what were then the best estimates of the Native American population in all of North America, this meant that roughly 13%, or roughly 1 in 7 Native Americans in North America lived in California. As we said before, there are over 100 tribes, speaking over 54 languages, 200 dialects. And scholars have pointed out that the linguistic landscape in California was perhaps the most complex in the whole world. Nearly all of the long, rich cultural history of these peoples, which had accumulated over thousands of years, the tribal myths, the legends, the stories, their histories, customs, and beliefs, even their languages, were about to be destroyed in the Native American Holocaust that was the European occupation of California. So let's turn now to how California was discovered by the Europeans and how it got its name. Up until the late 15th century, there have been these wandering minstrels and storytellers that went around from village to village telling all these legends and stories. But there was a change toward the late 15th century when the printing press was invented, and various authors began to use the printing press to print their own stories of these legends and sell them for a profit, a wholly new and revolutionary development. Among the first group of these authors was Garcia Rodriguez Montalvo, who, in Sevilla, Spain, in 1510, published his newest version of a centuries-old legend, The Adventures of Esteban. This book tells the fascinating fable about Esteban's visit to an island kingdom of a great black queen named Queen Califia. Queen Califia's island was full of jagged mountains, and there was no other metal but gold, and the women were all Amazons, who wore armor made of gold, and who killed all the men. In fact, they would feed infant males to the griffins on the island. Griffins, as you may recall, are mythical creatures with lions' bodies and birds' heads. The women had tamed the griffins and rode them like horses. The mythical island where Queen Califia lived was, quote, east of the old world, but west of the new. In 1513, the Spanish explorer Vasco Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean. Later, Spanish ships sailed up the west coast of Mexico to the Baja Peninsula, that immense 1,000-mile-long peninsula that sticks out and down the coast south from the California border. Intrigued by reports of pearls being discovered, the famous Spanish explorer Hernan Cortez launched his own expedition in 1535 and sailed to the Baja. When Cortez reached the Baja, he sailed for a short way up its eastern shore to a wide bay, which he named La Paz, peace, after the peaceful bay, where he'd anchored in 1533. There, difficulties of supply caused him to return before fully exploring the area. He left still believing that the Baja was an island, as it of course appeared to be, and not this immensely long peninsula. Now, the sailors on Cortez's ship had smuggled aboard copies of Montalvo's novel about the adventures of Esteban, which was written 18 years earlier. And in those days, there was a somewhat blurred distinction between fact and fiction. And Cortez sailors, noting the dark color of the natives on the Baja, They believed, incorrectly, that the Baja Peninsula was in fact an island, and noting further that this island was, quote, west of the New World, which was the Mexican mainland, and east of the Old World, which they knew to be west of the island they had discovered. This was exactly where the novel said that Queen Califia's magical island kingdom was located. So in honor of Queen Califia, they named this place California, California. There is some debate as to whether all of them truly believed this was Queen Califia's island, or whether it was a kind of a joke or a lighthearted gesture. But in any event, the name stuck. Then, when the Mexican rebellion against Spain succeeded in 1821 and the new nation of Mexico was created, Mexico claimed the area north of the Baja, all the way up to the British-claimed territory of Oregon, which includes the modern-day landmass of California. And they caused this huge area Alta California, meaning Upper California. And Upper California became the northernmost state of this new nation of Mexico, with a capital in Monterrey. When the U.S. and Mexico went to war against each other in 1846, Mexico lost that war and he ceded what is now the entire American Southwest to the U.S., that is California, Arizona, and New Mexico, as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the U.S.-Mexican War in 1848. And when the U.S. took possession of Alta California, since it was no longer Upper or Alta California, the Americans just dropped the prefix Alpha and just called their new territory California. Now, I can't resist sharing with you a fascinating little story about California being an island. You remember that Cortez's 1535 expedition, he initially believed that the Baja Peninsula was probably an island, but he wasn't sure. In 1539, at Cortez's orders, the Spanish explorer Francisco de Ulloa returned to the Baja, and after sailing the entire length of what's now called the Sea of Cortez, he decisively determined that the Baja was indeed a peninsula. His report, however, was intercepted by the Dutch, who shared it with the English. Here was an authentic report saying California was in fact a peninsula. But the Dutch and the English were paranoid. They were convinced this report was fake. It was a deliberate military misinformation campaign, and they decided not to believe it. As a result, mapmakers continued to draw California as an island. This era went on and on and on for 200 years. By far the greatest cartological error in the history of the world. Even numerous subsequent expeditions reconfirming the obvious fact that California was a peninsula could not stop this misinformation. Ultimately, it took no less than the personal intervention of the Spanish King Ferdinand VI himself to finally put a stop to it. A scholar named Glenn McLaughlin spent 40 years going around the world and collecting over 800 original California as an island maps, or copies of maps, the largest collection of its kind in the world. He donated this entire collection to the Stanford Library in 2011, and it is available for you to see online. The maps are chronologically listed so you can see minute and big differences over time. It is a fascinating collection. Now we come to the fascinating story of how the Spanish actually came to California. Throughout the 17th century, the Russians expanded eastward towards Siberia. Remember that in the U.S., we went west, the Russians went east. By the 18th century, the Russians had reached the Pacific Ocean. It was then that they hired the Danish sea captain, Vitus Bering, to explore further east. He led a Russian voyage that discovered the Bering Sea and Alaska. Soon the Russians colonized Alaska, establishing capitals first on Kodiak Island, then in Yakutat, and finally down in Sitka in southeast Alaska. This expansion freaked out the Spanish. First, Spanish King Philip V conceived of a repulsion strategy, the idea of, quote, boots on the ground. His vision was to establish 21 missions up and down about 600 of the 1,000-mile length of California. At this point, California was completely undefended and unpopulated by Europeans. It was one of the last temperate climate regions in the world that was not colonized by the Europeans or someone. Each mission was to consist of a church, a small presidio or fort, and a pueblo or village. Essentially, these were to be gigantic plantations with unpaid Native American serf labor doing all of the work. King Philip V did the preparations for these missions, but he died before he could get the job completed. The Spanish King Charles III, his successor, the so-called Enlightened Despot, took over this project. He expelled the Jesuits, engaged the Franciscans, and initiated the mission project. The Spanish selected Junipero Serra to lead this project to establish the California missions. Serra was not Spanish. He was a Mallorcan with a PhD in philosophy. He didn't even speak Spanish as his first language. When he was in his 30s, he suddenly had a conversion that changed his whole life. He went to Madrid, not Rome, it's important to note, and said to the Spanish, "Send me to the New World." They sent him to Mexico City to serve as an inquisitor, which is typically a person who burns witches. There, his enthusiasm and energy convinced the colonial Spanish that Serra was the right man for this mission job. Serra confined his colonization project to just the coastal section of South Central California. Beginning in 1769, Serra established Mission San Diego, the first of the missions. He continued to build them until his death in 1784, but the missions continued to be built. There were a total of 21 of them. They were 30 miles apart along the coast. The missions achieved their objective. They kept California in Spanish hands and led ultimately to Mexico taking over and then California when it was annexed by the U.S. Father Junipero Serra is an immensely controversial character. He was nominated for sainthood way back in the 1930s, but due to the extreme protests of the Native Americans in California, his sainthood was held up. And it was very controversial. Full-blooded Aholoni Native Americans with PhDs in history supported him, but great majority did not. He was a complicated character. St. Francis finally came to Washington in 2015 and consummated the project. He made Serra a saint. He's now Saint Junipero Serra in February 2020. Serra's statue was torn down in Golden Gate Park during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. The history of the California Spanish missions is one of widely and independently chronicled brutality toward the Native Americans. In contrast, the leader, Junipero Serra, was extremely pro-Native American in his ostensible stance. There were many examples where he came and he blocked the soldiers from brutalizing the natives. For example, when the Native Americans burned down Mission San Diego, the Spanish soldiers were going to hang them. Serra jumped in front of the bayonets and said, "You shall not touch them." There were a dozen other examples. Junipero himself was extremely pro-Native American in that relatively brutal time. It is important to note in the 18th century that the Spanish in California, the soldiers, the priests, the civilians, all believed without any doubt that if you could baptize a Native American, they would go to heaven. And if they were able to be in heaven, they would spend eternity in heaven thanking you for getting them baptized. This obviously was a huge license, and end justifies the means. And they also believed that God wanted Christians to do this, that he would lessen a person's time in purgatory as a reward if that person brought many souls to heaven via conversion and baptism. This letter gave a selfish motive for brutalizing the Native Americans and doing whatever it took, including forcing them to go through the motions of being baptized, even if they didn't have no comprehension of what it meant. But the sincerity of many of the Spanish cannot be doubted. Which leads us to the question debated by philosophers for centuries. How do we or anyone stand in moral judgment of what other people do? In this case, of what the Spanish priests and soldiers did 250 years ago in California, in a faraway culture in a time very distant from us, when they believed deeply that what they were doing was without any doubt the absolute right and moral thing to do and in the best interest of the people against whom they did it. There are thus people on both sides of this question. People who believe that Junipero brought Western civilization and Christianity to the Native Americans. On the other hand, there are those who believe that Junipero Serra was a brutal invader who facilitated the colonization of California, the stealing of the Native American lands, and the crushing of their civilization. As to the Spanish occupation of California itself, it succeeded in its mission. It kept the Russians out, it kept the British out, and it kept California in Spanish hands. But Spain did little with its holdings. There was so much potential to develop California, but Spain spent very little money and devoted almost no resources to developing California. There was never more than a few thousand Spanish in California at any given time in the entire state. And in a little appreciated note about history, Spain discovered in the Andes in Bolivia a mine called Potosi that was the most prolific mine in the history of the world. Potosi produced silver in such prodigious quantities that it propelled Spain into the forefront of European politics for over 230 years. Spain was also supported by its looting of the treasures of the Native American cultures throughout South America and Mexico. And there was a mine in Mexico that also produced silver called Zapotecas. And it's important to understand that at this point, Spain had virtually no tax base. They had an enormous ecclesiastical bureaucracy that pranced around in expensive robes and an enormous military bureaucracy that marched around in its uniforms and virtually no tax base. The Jews did some business and paid some taxes, but largely the rest of the Spanish population pretty much lived off of income from its colonies. Well, suddenly in the 19th century, the looting, which had pretty much run its course, ran out. The Zapotecas began to decline, and the prodigious mine at Potosi, the world's greatest source of silver, suddenly ran dry in the early 19th century. And when it did, Spain could not cope. It financially imploded. And this came to the attention of none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, who sent his troops into Madrid, put the King of Spain in prison, and put his brother, a Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. The significance of this here in California and throughout much of the rest of South America and Mexico was that this was New Spain. This was the viceroy of New Spain. These were Spaniards or people who saw themselves as Spanish colonists. And here their country was taken over by this Frenchman. It would be like Putin taking over and putting his brother in the White House in Washington. People would say, as they did here in California, I'm not paying taxes to that guy. A revolt broke out in California and throughout Mexico against the Spanish rule because it was viewed as now French rule. And the revolt was put down, but it came back and was put down again, and it continued to build steam until in 1821 the revolt succeeded, and California became the northernmost state of a new nation called Mexico. California was called Alta California, which meant Upper California to distinguish it from the Lower or Baja California, which was the peninsula, which, as you recall, was the original California. California was so far from Mexico City that it was just largely ignored by Mexico, even though it was a state and a very big one. Mexico struggled, and it took 5 years for the Mexican central government in Mexico City to even bother to send a governor to Monterrey to preside over the state of Alta California. Mexico continued to abuse and ignore California to the consternation of the Californios, as they call themselves. And this process only got worse as time went on. And finally, in 1835, both California and Texas revolted from Mexico. And most people are pretty aware of Texas because it succeeded in its revolution. Santa Anna, the military leader of Mexico, personally led the army of Mexico into Texas to put down the revolt that had sprung up there. And one of his lieutenants massacred some of the Texans who had tried to surrender. And this created such an outrage. The people came out of the woodwork, joined the army, and they captured Santa Anna himself. And he was convinced they were going to hang him. And the Texans said, look, if you'll just give us independence, we'll let you go. He said, you're going to let me go? Of course, you can have your independence. And so he gets on his horse and they let him. And as soon as the horse gets to the other side of the Rio Grande, he says, I take it all back. And he goes back to Mexico City and begins to build this army, which he's going to use to reinvade Texas. And it's not widely known at the same time that was going on, California, Alta California, was experiencing the same sort of abuses at the hands of the Mexican central government. And so in 1835, a California leader called Alvarado led a group of, including Anglo-speaking mountain men from the Sierras, and they went down to Monterey and they took over the capital and they declared California an independent nation. And they even designed a flag, which is actually in a museum down in Los Angeles. Now, under international law, to be a country, you have to be recognized by at least one other country. Texas was immediately recognized by 9 nations, and it became a legitimate country. There's a lot of profound international legal issues that attend whether you're a country or not, whether your bureaucrats or your diplomats are entitled to immunity and a host of other things. No one recognized California. So we were, in the eyes of the law, international law, just an insurgency. Also, and this has never happened that I can tell in any revolution in the history of the world, Alvarado and his colleagues in this successful revolution that declared California an independent country did a sort of an inventory, and they realized there were only about 1,500 non-Native Americans in California in its 1835, and they realized they saw the British ships and the Russian ships and the American ships, everybody going up and down the coast eyeing California with all this real estate and all this value, and they thought to themselves, we are too small to be a country. We will be taken over in 15 minutes. This isn't going to work. And Alvarado did something that I've never seen happen before. He went back, after consultation with his team, he went back to the envoys to Mexico, and he said, look, maybe we're a little hasty here, brothers. Maybe we can come back in and rejoin. What we'd like to do is we want to be autonomous, and we want a commitment from Mexico that you'll support us and protect us if we're ever invaded. Well, ordinarily, that never would have happened. But here, Santa Anna had been humiliated by what happened in Texas, and it was following the heels of the same thing happening in California. And so the idea that California would come back was immensely face-saving for him. And so he accepted them back, and he accepted their terms. And so California marched back into the clutches of Mexico and became Mexico again, Alta California. And it stayed that way. Now, Santa Anna began to build this enormous army, and he did it with the express and avowed purpose of going back to Texas, reconquering Texas, hanging Sam Houston and the Texans that had done what they did, and reclaiming it. In the meantime, Texas saw Santa Anna doing this, and they said, we're going to lose that war. So they thought, well, what we should do is join the United States. That would save us. So they went to the United States, and they said, we would like to join the United States as a state. And so James Knox Polk was president. He thought that was a splendid idea. He was a big manifest destiny guy, see the shining sea. And so he welcomed them. They initiated this incredibly legalistic process in which Texas and all the states and the Congress, they all voted about whether to accept Texas as a state. And everybody voted yes, including Texas. And so they decided to have Texas come in as a state. And Santa Anna, seeing this happen, and he's got this big army, he's going to go take Texas back, and it was a Mexican state. He goes to James Knox Polk and through his envoys, and he says, if you take Texas and make it a state, we, Mexico, are going to declare war on you, the United States. And when James Knox Polk heard that, he thought, my goodness, this is music to my ears. This is just the excuse I need to take the Southwest. So sure enough, Santa Anna declares war on the United States and starts making war against the United States. And James Knox Polk was this brilliant president of the United States. He had been a heavyweight player in the Tennessee legislature when he was practically a teenager, and he was the Speaker of the House, the only Speaker of the House ever been president. And he really understood, man. He was an innate leader, and he knew how to get things done. He knew how to use soft power and hard power. And so he immediately sends American troops to invade down the east coast of Mexico, and he takes this big town of Veracruz, and he sends American squadrons of military to the west coast of Mexico, and he starts taking cities and bombarding them. He doesn't take cities, he just shells them and embargoes them, puts up a blockade, and then he lets it be known to Santa Anna that he's going to hang Santa Anna. And, that tends to get these people. Santa Anna was a thug, and he just, that's what he would have done, and just really got his attention. And then James Knox Polk, being a brilliant soft power, hard power guy, who really understood power, and he understood who he was up against. And he knew that Santa Anna was just a thief who would steal money if we annexed the Southwest. So he goes to Santa Anna through envoys, and he says, look, we're going to be your neighbors forever, and we don't want any hard feelings. And we've had this misunderstanding about Texas. Why don't you go ahead and let us have Texas? And I'll tell you what, we'll declare the rest of it an annexation, and it'll save face for you, and we'll give you $20 million in gold, which is a fair price. Well, Santa Anna hears that, and he thinks to himself, well, you see, on the one hand, $20 million in gold, the other hand, losing the war and being hanged. I think he takes the deal. Okay, this freaks out the British. Why? Because British banks have loaned a fortune to Californios. Banks do this kind of thing. It's just amazing. And so the British sent a huge squadron of their naval ships to sail up and down California and to warn James Knox Polk and the Americans, if you do this, it's going to be war with us. And James Knox Polk had been fed up for a long time with what was called the condominium, which was this arrangement that the United States had with Great Britain, with everything north of the Oregon-California line was this, quote, condominium, which we jointly owned with Great Britain all the way to the Arctic Ocean. It was the Oregon Territory. So James Knox Polk said to the British, look, I'm done with this condominium. I want out. And I want everything south of this line, which we're going to call Canada, and you can have everything north of it. You can have full title to it. It's huge. It's bigger. It's all yours, and we want everything south of it, and it's all be all ours. And the British said, we don't want to do that. And so the British banks were screaming about these loans because they knew the Americans weren't going to pay them if California became America. So James Knox Polk, being this brilliant soft power guy, goes to the British banks and he says, look, there seems to be some misunderstanding here. You think that we're not going to pay you if they join the United States. And I'm here to tell you that if this deal on the condominium goes through, I will personally guarantee with the Treasury of the United States in writing every dime of the money that you British banks have improvidently loaned the Californios will be paid back with interest. And at the same time that happened, the British banks ran to the Foreign Office and they said, take this deal, let's do this deal. And in the meantime, the American naval officers who had seen how accurate the British guns were and how skilled they were, they said to James Knox Polk, we may not win this war. But on the British side, the British were buying all the cotton from the South. They relied on it. And all the textile industries needed it. Also British investors and banks were making a killing investing in American companies that were rapidly industrializing. So they all went to the Foreign Office and said, take this deal, take this deal. Well, the British did. And without a drop of blood or a bullet being fired, the British gave the United States full title to everything south of the Canadian border. They agreed on the border, some bickering about it, but they agreed to the border. And everything north of that, we gave to the British full title. And with Santana's $20 million in gold, Mexico gave us the entire Pacific Southwest. So in a matter of months, James Knox Polk increased the size of the United States by almost 60%. Everything from Louisiana, which included the Texas thing, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Utah, and Colorado, and Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. All this immensity suddenly it's just unquestionably, everybody agrees, hands shake, no bullets. It's unquestionably belongs to the United States. This was something that was just stunning. I mean, James Knox Polk, in a matter of months, had accomplished what had been dreamed of for generations, of having the United States stretch from sea to shining sea, and now it did. And everybody said, well, you're going to run again for a second term, right? You've got a 99% approval rating. You've got to do it. And he said, no, I promised I wouldn't. I'm not going to. Please, no. And he goes and he sits on his porch like he said he was going to do in Tennessee, rocks. And in 30 days, he was dead of cholera. So the United States signs a treaty on February the 4th, 1848, with Mexico called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty provided that on July the 4th, 1848, we would hand over the $20 million and title would pass, and the entire southwestern United States, all that land would be the United States, and the war would be over. Now, 11 days before the treaty was signed, on January 24th, 1848, there was a discovery in Sutter's Mill up in Coloma in the Sierras. There was a famous Swiss-German entrepreneur in California, been around since the 1820s. He built Sacramento, it was called Sutter's Fort. His name was Johann Suter, and we Americans decided his mother was mispronouncing his name, so we decided to call him John Sutter. And after a while, he said, okay, I'm John Sutter. And he needed lumber for his Sutter's Fort, which became Sacramento. And so he sent up this New Jersey-born carpenter named John Marshall. And he went up to this little town called Coloma, and he built a sawmill. In those days, the water would go down in a circular turnstile that would turn a huge saw that would cut wood. And so when he got it finished, he went and he looked in the traces, which is where the water comes down, and he saw these yellow rocks. And he said in his memoirs later that I knew immediately it was gold. So he scoops up a bunch of it, takes it down to his boss, John Sutter, and he says, what are we going to do about this, boss? And he says, John Sutter says, let's not tell anybody. And of course they get drunk immediately and tell this local big shot entrepreneur named Sam Brannan, who was a Mormon leader, and he in San Francisco, and he had a shop in San Francisco. He had a shop in Coloma and one in Sacramento. And Brannan immediately grasped what was going to happen. He was not the slightest bit interested in sticking his hand in that cold, muddy water. He wanted to mine the miners. And he became the first millionaire. And what he did is he sent off all over the known world, then, which was Acapulco and Honolulu and some other places, for camping equipment and picks and axes and pans for panning gold. He said, I'll take everything you got times 10. I'll pay cash as soon as he arrives. And he cleaned out those cities, and all came when it arrived on May the 12th, 1848. Sam Brannan took a jar of gold nuggets that had been brought to his shop from people who were discovering all this gold in the Sierra, held it up over his head, and ran down the main street of San Francisco, which is called Montgomery Street, screaming, gold, gold, gold. There's gold everywhere, all over the American River. And before the sun set, there wasn't a single soul in San Francisco. They had cleaned out. They'd all rushed off they all believed him, and they took off for gold. And in the meantime, up in Coloma, the town itself, of course, the husbands and the wives had gone their coffee breaks and gone out to the creeks. And what happens is this was placer gold. This was sand. Sand is placer in Spanish. And up in the Sierras in the winter, there's huge rains and snows, and it washes down and the exfoliating, cracking up rock into small pieces of sand, and they wash down the streams. And the heavier gold, which is 9 times as heavy as the sand, sinks to the bottom of the streams. And if you scrape off the sand on top to the hard rock bottom of a stream, at the very bottom, you find all these yellow gold nuggets. And so these people were amassing all this gold from all the streams around Coloma. And they went down, and it turns out there was an assay office in Sacramento, and these families would pool it together and go down and say, well, excuse me, sir, I found these rocks up in the American Creek. And is it gold? And if it is, how much is it worth? And the assay guy would look at it, and he'd weigh it, and he'd hold it up, and he'd test it with some acid or this or that, and he would come back and say, yeah, it's gold, and I figure it's worth about $2,000. And they would stagger, because this is a time when the average person made $8 to $12 a month. So all the men went back to their wives, and they said, honey, I got me this great job, here in Coloma. I'm making $20 a month. That's a lot, Should I keep my $20 a month job, or should I quit my $20 a month job and go out and get another $2,000 worth of that gold? And all the wives said, I don't believe I have to answer a question like that. Get out there and get me that gold. Within 30 days, there wasn't one soul in this little town of Coloma that had a job. And this spread, like you throw a rock into a lake, the ripples go out in concentric circles. There was no telegraph entering, so news spread as fast as a man could ride a horse or a ship could sail. And it just spread out in concentric circles, to Honolulu and to Mexico and all around the state of California and up into Oregon. And 75% of all the eligible males in the territory of Oregon came down, left their wives, families, businesses, ranches, and came to look for gold. People poured in every which way. And gradually this thing built and built and built all during the year. And all eyes turned to Washington because he'd heard all this stuff before. Gold, and it never quite panned out. And so all eyes turned to James Knox Polk. He was giving a State of the Union. They did it in those days in December. So he got up before the joint session of Congress, and everybody knew he was going to talk about the gold thing, and they were all on the seat of the edge of their seats listening. What's he going to say about gold? And he said, these reports about gold in this California are of such a caliber they scarcely command belief. Were they not verified by officers in the public service? Which was another way of saying it's all true. And his speech before Congress, in this joint session of Congress, State of the Union speech by James Knox Polk, it was electric. It was a nuclear bomb. People everywhere on the earth believed him. And within a few weeks, there was 100,000 people en route to this little place called San Francisco. And what was there? Practically nothing. There was no hotels, there was no food, there was no medical, there was no supplies, no place for them to stay. And worst of all, there was no law. But they came anyway. And ultimately, 300,000 to 500,000 people from 20 countries came to California to look for gold. Most of them did not find it. A lot of them came to mine the miners, and most of them went home broke. Most of the people that showed up, and this is not generally appreciated, of course it was all men, except for a handful of prostitutes, and they were all young. They were teenagers. Those pictures you see of miners up in the Sierra, these were teenagers. People left home at 12 years old in those days. William Richardson, who founded San Francisco, left home when he was 12, And when you look at the ages of famous people at that time, for example, the Marquis de Lafayette, when he helped us in the Revolution at the signing of the Declaration, he was 18 years old. Nathan Hale was 21. Alexander Hamilton, whose picture's on the $10 bill, he was 21. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was 33. And Lord Cornwallis, the supreme admiral of the British Navy, was 37. Well, these gold miners in California were overwhelmingly just teenagers, and they had come from upper class families along the eastern coast, many of them, and they'd gotten on sailboats in the East Coast and sailed all the way around Cape Horn. And when they were doing that, they would give each other plays and stuff and do the Greek theater and Shakespeare and stuff, which gives you an idea about their background. When they got here, the conditions were ghastly. They were living in these tents, and rain was leaking on them, and everything was so. It was the most expensive place in the world by 20. And inflation reached its highest here ever reached in the history of the world, because all this gold, but all the captains and the crew would jump ship, so there was no way to get ships in and out. But these young gold miners up in the gold country, in the mining, got along with each other and conducted themselves with amazing amount of grace and maturity. And given that it was in the middle of nowhere and there was all this money at stake and all this tension and everything, it was really quite a scene that reflected well on everybody. Now, it took about 5 years for the gold miners that arrived to pretty much clean out all the stream beds in the Sierra where this easily accessible gold was, the sand placer gold. And at that point, the amount of gold that was being successfully recovered dropped drastically. In San Francisco, which was the main city here that was financing and handling all this, it fell into a deep recession, almost a depression for which it would never have recovered at all, but for the fact that in 1859, there was discovery of the Comstock lode of silver, of a virtual mountain over what is now Virginia City, Nevada, that was almost pure silver. And there was 3 to 5 times as much money in that silver as there was in the initial gold rush. And how much was the initial gold rush? It was more than you could ever would have imagined. The U.S. Geological Survey it spent years trying to figure out the answer to that question. How much gold was there? And they finally determined with pretty high accuracy that it was roughly $18 billion in 2012 dollars that was just picked up out of the streams in the Sierras in the first 5 years of the gold rush. And then, as I explained, in 1859 comes the silver, then the Comstock lode, 3 to 5 times as much, all banked, financed, staffed, provisioned by San Francisco, so the money stuck in San Francisco. And that lasted for a long time. And then in 1869, the railroad reached San Francisco and bring in a whole new different type of prosperity. You could get on a railroad car and ride all the way to Washington in a few days. But as we mentioned, most of the 300,000 to 500,000 people in the greatest peacetime migration in the history of the world who came to California in the 1850s looking for gold, most of them went home broke and empty-handed, but almost every one of them, this was recorded in numerous ways, to their last day said that the time they spent in California panning for gold, looking for gold, was the most exciting time of their entire life, and they didn't regret a minute of it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, on July the 4th, 1848, California territory became, no longer Mexico, became territory of the United States. That is not the same as saying that it was a state of the United States. It was just U.S. territory at that point. And California wasn't a state. So California petitioned to be a state immediately. It had the sufficient population of 50,000. And there was a big fight about it because California wanted to come in as a free state. And right at that point, they were having all these battles over slavery, and the South wanted the balance of the Senate to be the same, so it needed a slave state. So finally, the compromise of 1850 was reached, and California entered the United States as a state on September the 9th, 1850, as a free state. And there were wild celebrations all over the state of California, especially in San Francisco. So, where are we? We begin this podcast with California's geologic beginning, going back 600 million years. And then its occupation 13,000 years ago by Native Americans from Siberia. Then its Spanish colonization in the mid-18th century, through the revolution that was successful in 1821, making California the northernmost state of the new nation of Mexico, the state of Alta California. Then the American conquest in 1846, the annexation of California in 1848, followed by a discovery of gold, which kicked off the gold rush era and stampeded hordes of people coming into California, which made it eligible to become the 30th state of the United States in September of 1850. And this brings us to the end of today's California Pre-Modern History podcast on Digital Voices. This is Robert Mills, your host. Hope you enjoyed listening, and we hope to see you back here again soon for future podcasts on Digital Voices.
Hey, Robert. How you doing today?
I'm doing fabulous. It's great to be with you again.
Having just listened to your presentation, you've added another chapter of the West Coast and its understanding. I think you guided us really well through, everything from the immersion of the landmass, which is a lot more recent than I would have thought, to the types of animals that originally inhabited that area, which was, I was thinking it was dinosaurs. Obviously, it was hoofed creatures. And then land bridge that was raised as a result of the glaciers, and it was just so well done. A couple things that I wanted to ask about. So,
Far away.
I was, again, impressed that that landmass is so new, but we talked about how the glaciers had kind of sucked up 400 feet of water during that time. How thick did those glaciers get?
Well, the thickness would vary depending on where the glaciers were. The ice was much deeper at the poles, of course, than it is now. And it covered the ground, as you know, all the way down to Wisconsin, where you live, in the Midwestern states that were covered in ice. And it got deeper as it went north. There were glaciers in California that filled the entirety of Yosemite Valley, which is a huge, deep valley, thousands and thousands of feet ice, all the way up to the rim and then some. And today you can see this glacier polish on the rocks all over Yosemite, this smoothing, evidencing that polish that took place. And there were glaciers on mountains like Mount Shasta in California that were miles thick. And they came all the way down to Redding, the city of Redding, which is about 65 miles from the mountain and is down near sea level. So there were lots of different thicknesses of this ice, and it covered most of the northern hemisphere above about the level of Wisconsin, which is about 43 degrees latitude.
So quite a large area covered with ice. What types of animals lived in that temperate zone that was still green and luscious?
Well, in California, as we mentioned, the dinosaurs walked the earth for about 140 million years. They started wandering, evolved about 205 million years ago, and they were around to about 65 million years ago before they all went extinct. And California, unfortunately, was underwater most of that time, and so the surface rocks in California are, especially in the western portion of, this west of the Sierra Nevadas, which is most of it, are really young as rocks go. And so California, unfortunately, has no bones of dinosaurs, no fossils really to speak of that go back very far. And it's all really recent stuff in California. The dinosaur bones are in other states. And the animals that lived here, though, were, there was the biggest profusion of wildlife in the whole world took place in the Central Valley and around San Francisco about 15,000 years ago. And there was just all manner of animals that lived here, camels and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and all these gigantic animals that were all went extinct. And largely what they were believed to be made extinct by people that and men and women hunted them down and killed them. That's what happened to them. And it's why they disappeared.
So, I really like the evolution and background with the Spanish and the original settling of that area post-native. I found that interesting in how the U.S. also picked up, the West Coast and the cost of it. And it was a peaceful transition. Anything else that you might have forgot or that you wanted to add?
Well, I think that it is largely unappreciated, the degree to which the President of the United States, James Knox Polk, used this combination, this expert combination of soft power and hard power to acquire the Southwest from Mexico with relatively limited. We did go to war with Mexico, but it was relatively limited bloodshed. He blunted that war by using the soft power, offering the Mexicans $20 million in gold for the entire Southwest, and that caused a huge amount of face saving and rationale for it. And the truth is, it's another thing that not really that appreciated is that the Mexicans, largely, it was a very new country, and they largely viewed the Southwest as part of the Viceroy of New Spain, which is where they came from, and they didn't really see that, didn't have a national identity with California. And, they saw it was just sand up there. And so there was very little interest. They thought it was worthless desert. And it's telling on this point, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of this, is that Mexico had thought so little of California when it was formed, which was in 1821, that they didn't even send a governor to govern Alta California, which is what they call California, for 4 years after independence. It was 1825. So that shows you that California was very low on the priorities of Mexico. And when they offered $20 million gold, it seemed like a hell of a good deal. And it's interesting how that contrasts with Russia and Alaska. I've been to Russia and sat in dashas outside Moscow, and the Russians really still have strong feelings about Alaska, as amazing as it is. We bought it from them in 1867, and the Russians sort of still feel like it really ought to be theirs. They were kind of swindled, and there's still feelings about it, which are not present at all with respect to Mexicans in California. And with China and Taiwan, it's amazing. China feels that Taiwan, this little island out in the Pacific, is an integral part of China. They're willing to go to war over it, and we got trouble coming on that. So I think that's an interesting, take on why it was as smooth as it was, the $20 million to get and then of course James Knox Polk went to Britain, and he threatened them all kinds of ways, but they had loaned all this money to these banks, and he said, we'll guarantee that, and we're going to go to war against you, and we'll give you everything north of the Canadian border, which they were about to set. And the British say, hey, this is probably a good deal too. And in just a stroke of the pen, in a matter of months, James Knox Polk increased the size of the United States by about 60%, sea to shining sea, and he became incredibly popular. And he doesn't get a lot of credit for that, unfortunately. He's popular at the time, and when he came time for him to run for re-election, people said, you have to run. You have this popularity. Both sides want you to run. And he says, I'm not running. I said I was only going to run 4 years, and serve for 4 years. I've served my 4 years. I'm going home. And he went home and sat on his porch in Tennessee and rocked and died of cholera in 30 days.
It's interesting how that works out. It's yes. I also found the railroad, you had $18 billion in 1820 that came out of the first 5 years of the gold rush, which the fact that was discovered just days before this treaty actually was finalized, I think was just a stroke of luck. And, that money fueled the development of the West Coast and really the United States for some time.
It did. It was a lot more money than people realized. And there were estimates, and these are have to be taken with a grain of salt, that 300 to 500,000 people came to California in the gold rush, which was the biggest migration of its type in world history. And some people say it's much really closer to the lower end of that. And most of them didn't stay. And so only a portion of that actually went to pan for gold. The others went to become ranchers and farmers and merchants and stuff. And so, some say that at tops, there was 150,000 that actually panned for gold, at least a little bit. And so if you divide up that $18 billion, that's $120,000 each in 2012 dollars. That's why it was such a transformative event, the gold rush, and why it supported these huge changes. It actually took the whole U.S. out of a depression. But when we translate that, it's important to understand that the purchasing power of things was very different then. Manufactured goods were very expensive, and like guns and stuff were incredibly more expensive then. But food items like beef were very much cheaper. So the purchasing power was a different kind of analysis. But any way you slice it, that's an enormous amount of money that was and the silver rush. San Francisco fell into this horrendous depression after the 5 years, and it never would have recovered from that, but for the fact they discovered the Comstock lode of silver in Nevada, which was 3 to 5 times more money. And it was financed, supported, banked, provisioned, staffed by people in the money stayed in San Francisco, and it really made the city of San Francisco. And of course, in 1869, the railroad showed up, and so you have the three dates. 1849 for discovery of gold, 59 for silver, and 69 for the railroad. And this is a period, and I think we lose sight of this. We're living now in a period of technological upheaval, but there was enormous technological upheaval then. Steam engines came into play right about this time, and they started powering boats with them. And it used to take, at the beginning of the gold rush, 6 to 9 months to take a sailboat around South America to get to San Francisco. And very shortly, steam-powered boats enable you to make that trip in 30 days. You go 2 weeks to Panama, cross in a railroad, and get on another steamship and come to San Francisco in 30 days. And the telegraph arrived in San Francisco in 1861, and that was, of course, an enormous revolution, instant communication with the East Coast. And the telegraph immediately bankrupted the Pony Express, which was how mail things were being delivered. And there's a great backstory here to this. Lincoln, sitting in the Oval Office, had the first transcontinental communication ever with Stephen Field, who was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. Why him? Because the governor was out of town, so they grabbed him and they said, "You got to talk to the president." And so Stephen Field sent Abraham Lincoln in this first transcontinental communication support of California for the Union in the upcoming Civil War. And this endeared Stephen Field to Abraham Lincoln. The two started a correspondence, and Lincoln eventually appointed Stephen Field to the United States Supreme Court. And in the meantime, Stephen Field had written what is now Californians call the Field Code, which was this incredibly revolutionary civil code for civil law in California. It was adopted all over the country. But then Fields went on in the Supreme Court of the United States to develop this theory of the power of the contract clause in the Constitution to greatly limit the power of the federal government to legislate. And that was it was picked up, this Field theory was picked up and amplified until the New Deal. The justices on the Supreme Court overturned FDR's New Deal on the theories that Justice Field had put forward. And, FDR was about to pack the court to get around that when one of the justices died and the other one resigned, and FDR was able to appoint 2 new justices and get his New Deal legislation passed. But there's people now who, I subscribe to this blog called SCOTUS blog, it's the Supreme Court blog. It's a very, very well-known and popular reporting of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the conservative majority on the court now is going back and re-looking at this field doctrine with the idea of severely limiting the power of the federal government in things like, for example, where the federal government has the power to regulate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so we're back to, field is back to being relevant again now. So I thought that's a nice little excursus to go on here with the gold rush and the technology that was changing the world then.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing, just the steps. A lot of things happen in a short period of time, relatively, that really propelled us to where we are today as a country. And the resources that were provided out west naturally really were a blessing to us as a nation. And the way that shaped us, especially with the telegraph and the railroad, and you are a walking encyclopedia, sir. Let me ask you this. What are we going to be looking at for our next podcast with you? What's the next topic we're going to hit?
That's a very good question. I am continue to be enthralled with the notion of hinge points in history. And I'm going back and looking at some of them, technological hinge points, military hinge points. There were points in the world where we're going to go one way as opposed to other way, and I will propose to you a number of them, and that you maybe pick which one you think is the most interesting. But I continue to be fascinated by how much our world is the way it is because of some extremely narrow and wobbly decision went left as opposed to right, and had it gone right, things would be radically different. I've done podcasts with you about the Spanish Armada and how it had that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they won. We would be Catholic, and there'll be no science and everything. And then the Battle of Tours, we'd be Muslim. And with the Battle of Saratoga, the British would have won the American Revolution, and there would be no America. And all these things were much closer in how they turned out and random. And the whole world is the way it is because of that hinge point turning the way it did. And so I'm going to go back and examine some of these, do the research, and offer you a podcast that, again, talks about how the world came up to this fork in the road. And had we gone to the right, things would be unimaginably different. But we went to the left, and it was close, and why it was close, and what it all meant, and why it is so incredible that it turned out the way it did.
Yeah, it's almost like the world is ruled by chance.
Amazingly chance, it was a saying among lawyers that to be successful, you have to work hard, and you have to work smart, and you have to be lucky, and lucky is 99% of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I look forward to that. Thank you so much for putting this presentation together. I think it was, again, just a great compliment to what we did already about modern day California. Also gave us terrific insight from the beginning, if you will. And so for that, I thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Bill. Always delightful to talk with you. Good luck. Bye.
Bye. Perfect.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.